Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. The lessons on culture studies continue. This is Pramod K. Nair from the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad. Today we will be looking at the domain study as a case for the theories of culture studies in operation. Our specific task for today is to look at the question of identity. What does identity mean in cultural studies? Identity is something we know instinctively as a story about ourselves, how we recognize and identify ourselves. In cultural studies, the idea of identity is enmeshed within various other domains. This has to do with the question of discourse, power, culture, the cultural imaginary, the process of acquiring identity, the possibilities of resisting identities, questions of interpolation and acculturation. In culture studies, the argument that there is an essential identity has been deemed to be inappropriate. Identity is something fluid and in constant process, being made, remade and unmade. These approaches to identity that I have just talked about come from various philosophical and schools of thought within critical theory. These include post-structuralism, feminism, Marxism, queer cultural studies. For post-structuralists, identity is a product of discourse. Discourse is a system of rules, norms and conventions which allow certain things to be said and certain things are prohibited from being said. In the case of culture studies, we are interested in discourses in popular culture governed by the state, by the market, that allow certain kinds of identities to be established, spoken about and publicized. These would include discourses of appearance, of dependability, authenticity. These that I have listed are components of identity that public, popular and mass discourses circulate in the form of television programming, film representations, popular cultural forms on television, soap operas and things like that. Identity therefore is a result of how one makes this presentation within an available and already circulating discourse. Identity is not automatic, it is something that is constructed and is part of a larger process. However, when we say it is constructed within discourse, we also immediately recognize the fact that this discourse can be controlled. Who classifies, defines, in what way certain identities are deemed to be natural, preferable or dependable is a question essentially of power. That is, what I am trying to get you to see here is there is no such thing as a natural identity. Identity constructed within discourses are liable to be controlled, tested, rejected and appropriated by systems of power relation. How one presents oneself, therefore, is not a natural choice. The act of representing identity is very frequently subject to norms of control, norms of social conventions, and norms of even state intervention in the form of censorship. To take a very common example of identity being constructed in discourse and how theory has formulated its objection to this kind of identity formation, my examples come from post-colonial theory. The construction of non-European identity as inferior, savage or barbaric, ancient and in ruins is a result of European representations of this. That is, the natives did not really have an option to speak about themselves for the very simple reason that they could only speak within the discourse already available to them as made, formulated and defined by the Europeans. Post-colonial theory notes the fact that our sense of ourselves as Indians or Africans is the consequence of speaking within the discourse whose rules have been laid down by the Europeans. Our sense of ourselves, our sense of an identity, therefore proceeds not from any natural source, but because we can only represent ourselves in the languages, the grammar, the systems of representation already predetermined for us by Europeans. For feminists, the question of a feminine identity is also, in practically the same terms as post-colonial theory, the subject of discourse. When I use the phrase the subject of discourse, I mean it in two senses. You are made a subject to, and you are the subject as constructed by. For feminists, the idea of sex versus gender proceeds from this important notion of discourse. Sex is a biological condition, but gender is socially constructed. When we say it's socially constructed, it automatically means it's constructed within discourses and systems of representation. These discourses and systems of representation are controlled by larger power structures in society. This could be patriarchy, this could be class, this could be race, this could be nation. In other words, what we see feminists doing is unpack the idea that the condition of a feminine identity is natural and innate to a woman. The idea of the feminine is not natural, it's not biological. What constitutes femininity is defined by discourses outside the body. When the body decides, shall we say, and I'm using the word decides in a very loose sense, to present itself as feminine, it has to fit into already available definitions of the feminine. Otherwise, it will not be constituted as or acceptable as feminine. For the feminists, this has become a major source of complaint, because women do not control the discourses in which they are constructed as women. For people from other races, if you recall what I just said from post-colonial theory, certain races are made invisible. Now, invisible identities are identities whose presence in the social order, whose assertion, whose difference from other classes or identities is determined by discourses that may or may not give them the scope to speak about themselves. Invisibilizing is the absence that you see at the heart of discourses, because the existing power relations in society have deemed certain identities as immaterial, as not essential. When we look at, for instance, nations' constructions of alternate sexualities, minorities, so-called untouchable or lower classes, the working classes, they do not figure in national histories because the discourse of national history does not deem their identities as important enough as a part of the larger national project of identifying itself as a nation. In the US, for instance, the Native Americans till the 80s were an invisible race. They were invisible because they had no chance to represent themselves as part of an American project. It's only from the 80s with radical political campaigns that they begin to find themselves made visible. The discourse of visibility that I'm using here has to do, therefore, with every known case of minorities, other cultures, other races being excluded from national projects and national definitions. How does identity get formed? Is identity innate to a person? The answer has been already given, no. If it is not innate to a person, how does any individual, group, community assert itself, identify itself? The answer to this is identities are constituted within a cultural imaginary. The cultural imaginary is a set of representations, primarily popular, in which we see ourselves, from which we borrow systems of representation, and in which we can see a connection with the lives we lead. The cultural imaginary also sets up goals and aspirations of what one ought to be. Why cultural imaginary? Given the fact that we are looking at cultural studies, we are not interested in only the state, that is the government's construction of identities. We are interested in popular cultural forms. The cultural imaginary consists of newspaper records, of television soap operas, of films, all sorts of things in the popular domain in which certain races, cultures, ethnic communities, groups and individuals get represented. The cultural imaginary is also the discourse or system of representations in which certain features, certain qualities, certain behavioral norms are established as desirable. one acquires a sense of the cultural imaginary through a process of acculturation. Take, for instance, familiar images that flit across our television screens. Advertisements, propaganda are excellent examples where the color of one's skin, the aptitude in certain disciplines, certain kinds of physical attributes, certain intellectual qualities are presented to us as desirable. When you look at training programs, whether at school level or all the way up to finishing schools and training programs at corporate offices, what you see is a set of factors that are classified as desirable qualities is established. Whether you fit those qualities, that set of qualities or not, is the point. That is, your identity as a, quote, confident young man is based on how society has defined confident. Now, you might very well find yourself or think of yourself or believe yourself to be confident, but unless this fits in with already circulating opinions and norms as to what constitutes confidence, you don't get the job. What I'm trying to say here is norms of appearance, ability, which could be physical or intellectual, capacities to work, the skill sets that corporate and government employees talk about are norms in which your identity must figure. If it doesn't, then you need to acquire those ones. In other words, when I present myself as a confident young man, as a person who's qualified to do a certain job, I need to fit the norms that pre-exist my story about myself. Otherwise, I have to train myself. Therefore, what you are seeing here is the formation of identity in the form of the desirable qualities listed for you. Look at advertisements for health drinks on television. Why should children be of a certain height or of a certain complexion? The advertisements will tell you, oh, but you see, the taller child is a more confident child. This makes the height and the complexion equal to confidence, and these three, height, complexion and confidence, are deemed to be desirable qualities. So the parents and the children begin to assume, and this is where the crucial part lies, that they have to acquire these qualities in order to fit in. So a short, dark-skinned person is automatically not confident, they are not worth employers' time, they are not worth jobs. What we are looking at therefore here is our processes of acculturation, the processes of the cultural imaginary in operation, which tells us what qualities to acquire. Our identity therefore is constantly modified by the demands made upon us by the social order, by the employment opportunities around us. Identity therefore, as you can see, is not constant. It's fluid, it's flexible, it's alterable. In order for us to be recognized for what we are, we need to have the qualities that the world says this is what we are looking for. Our everyday lives, our social interactions, our personal relations are automatically part of a larger cultural condition in which these qualities are deemed to be worthy. When, for instance, any company suggests these are essential qualifications and these are desirable qualifications, what are they talking about? They're dividing your identity into two lines, into two categories. One, absolute basic minimum that they need, and others which are preferable. For instance, it is not enough for you to have the skill set to do a technical job. You need to have the skill set to be a social person who does the technical job. Now, you can very well ask, how has my social ability connected to my technical ability? The answer is social abilities, social skill sets are deemed to be not essential but desirable or preferable. We are therefore looking at the making of an identity if I want a job where I not only acquire the technical expertise that fit me for the job, but also the kind of social skills I might need in order to be the most preferred employee. What we are looking at therefore is identity that works outside ourselves, outside our attributes, qualities, features we are born with. Now, if you think a little carefully about this, this is very different from the original idea of identity, which said you are born this way. These are your qualities. Post-structuralism, feminism, Marxism and others tell you that those might have been the qualities you were born with, but those are not the qualities you grow up into, for the simple reason that if you want to fit into the larger social rubric, get employment, have social relations, you need definitely to acquire an identity that the social order accepts. If you want a one-line thesis at this point, I would say identity is what is validated by the social order into which you have to insert yourself. Identity is not something innate to you, it's not immanent to you. This process of fitting into a larger cultural imaginary through the absorption of representations around us is often called interpolation, a term popularized by the Marxist thinker Louis Althusser. Interpolation is, in common words, acculturation. Interpolation occurs at various stages. The primary process of interpolation comes from the non-formal education that families give us. Sit like this, stand like that, talk like this, that is rude, this is acceptable, be polite. What are these instructions that we grow up with? These are modes of making us suitable to a social environment in which these are qualities that are regarded as the mark of a quote-unquote polite child. That is, a polite child is one who begins to develop an identity whereby certain modes of speech, clothing, dress sense, walking, talking are all built into the system. I am not born that way. I don't necessarily think that way. Interpolation is the process whereby these forms of behavior pre-exist me. I interpolate myself into that because that's the only way for me to survive. Now, the crucial thing about this process of interpolation is they are gendered and they are classed. Girl children will behave in the following way. Male children will behave in the following way. What we are looking at here, therefore, is the construction of gender roles that pre-exist the child and into which the child must be trained. It's not natural. It's not something you're born with. Please remember this. Interpolation is the pre-existing gender roles or class roles into which the child is trained into accepting and believing. What we are looking at here, therefore, is identities that are forged, identities that are crafted when you insert yourself into a cultural regime. The cultural regime could be of various elements. I mentioned a few for you. How you talk, look, walk, behave, interact with social and superiors and your peer group, how we write. Please remember, your handwriting was a subject of considerable discussion in your school. Why? A person with a bad handwriting is automatically deemed to be this way, that way. How to keep your room, how to arrange your table. These become gendered because the role determines your identity. The feminine role is something that girl child is interpolated into. The girl child does not know how to be a girl unless she is told how to be a girl. I am talking about the telling. How people are told is the process of acculturation. It is what bestows them with their identity. This automatically leads us to the next point. For identity to be recognized, to be believed in, it has to be performed again and again. What do we mean by this? Feminist critics, queer theorists like Judith Butler argued that identity is a performative. It's only when you perform your identity repeatedly, when you go on doing the same thing, that you get classified as so and so. Boys cannot alternate their clothes from one day to the next. Boy dress one day, girl dress the next day. Boys will consistently dress like boys. Girls will consistently dress like girls. Boys will also consistently, over a period of time, behave like boys, talk like boys. Girls will do likewise. What we are looking at here is that there is a close link between the way you perform your identity and the identity that comes to be associated with you. I use the word association in two ways. You begin to believe yourself to be the boy or girl, and the world sees you as a boy or girl. So association works two ways. By the repeated performance of boyness or girlness, I come to believe I am a boy or girl, as the case may be, and the social order around me validates that, oh yes, you are a boy or girl. What should emerge from this is really again a reiteration of a point I've made before. Identity is not in me. Identity is what I perform because a role has been given to me to perform, and I do this every day. Identity is the space of that performative. It has to be repeated, it has to be socially validated. But the crucial thing to understand here is, you might believe yourself to be X or Y, but until such time as you perform it and that performance is validated by the social order, you are not X or Y. What I'm saying here is, it requires the validation of an external social order for you to be possessing any identity. You cannot be this or that until the world says you are this or that. Let's take an example as a case study. How does one perform old age? Do you expect an old man to be running after a bus, standing with the rest of the people in the crowded bus? Or do you expect the old man to stand fragile in a corner, wait for the bus to come, and then occupy seats earmarked for senior citizens? You see, by sitting in the seat meant for senior citizens, you have performed your identity as a senior citizen. You are asked proof of identity when you book on railways and other systems of transport. You get medical discounts. You have hospital cards on you. Your hospital card, which says you are entitled to a discount. Your senior citizen card, the age being announced on your PAN card or your Aadhaar or whatever. Your activity, you dress in certain ways. The kind of behavior you might indulge in, it's highly unlikely that a 75-year-old man is humming a song while he walks around. What do we understand by that? We say, oh, you know, that guy doesn't behave like an old man. When you say he doesn't behave like an old man, what exactly are you saying? What you're saying is, we have a notion of how an old man within quotes should behave. The old man, to fit into the category of old man, should behave like that. Otherwise we'll say, that fellow doesn't behave like an old man. Therefore, we don't give him the respect of an old man. We don't need to give him the privileges of being old. The old man would say, well, you see, I don't feel that old. But you can't make that as an assertion or a definitive statement, because the social order in which you live acknowledges the fact that you ought to be behaving like an old person of a certain age. What we see here, therefore, is a performance of old age in terms of food, how they walk, how they dress, how they go through routine acts in the daytime, whether it's waiting for a bus or going to the bank, and the obsession with medical details. Are we then saying that identity cannot be resisted? Are we then saying that the performance of identity is fixed for us for all time? Or are there possibilities within this performance that we can maybe play around a little bit with identities? Now, surely we understand that teenagers behave like teenagers, old people behave like old people, mothers behave like mothers. But sometimes we do see that mothers don't always behave like very responsible, caring mothers. Teenagers don't behave like teenagers. Important interventions in this debate about identity came from the feminists, because they argued that the woman is constantly being pinned to a particular category, mother, wife or daughter. Are these the only identities available to them? What if the woman wants a different identity? For the feminists, the roles assigned to specific genders, homemaker, primary caregiver, mother or daughter, has invariably been highly restrictive, because it determines your identity for you without asking whether that is the identity you choose to have. What therefore must strike you here is that the possibility that the identity is predetermined for you may not necessarily be something you choose to possess for yourself, or those might be identities you might not want to possess all the time. A primary caregiver or a mother can at some point feel, I want to stop being a mother for some time. The old man can say, I don't understand why all these people continue to think of me as old. There are certain things I would like to do, even though my age and my appearance may not necessarily say that he's capable of doing it. Occasionally you'll see in newspapers about 75-year-old people who are doing base jumping. And you ask, why should this guy who's 75 years old do that? 2 years ago, the senior president George Bush did bungee jumping as well, and it made headlines all over the world. And you ask, why is this 75-year-old former president of the United States jumping off the cliff? What we are actually asking is a less polite question. Why can't the old man behave like an old man? Why can't the woman behave like a mother? For the feminists, and the most crucial interventions have, like I said, come from feminist theory, identity is a project in which one should have a certain measure of agency, the right to change things, alter things in some way. Identity as a project is partly the result of a lot of critical interventions that have come from campaigns, activists, political thinkers, and theory. It has to do with the new spaces being opened up via globalization. So, for instance, people who are of a certain age and who are deemed to be not familiar with or comfortable with technology, taking to Facebook and social media seem like an aberration. Why? Primarily because the digital media has for a very long time been presented as a youth medium. It has been presented as something invented by the young, for the young and the upwardly mobile, and then to discover that 70-year-old people are also using it to determine insurance policies, travel arrangements, tourism, and all sorts of other things, seems as though the media doesn't fit them, they don't fit the media, or conversely, they seem to be perfectly happy fitting into the media as well. Now, what we are looking at here is we increasingly have many ways in which an identity project can be undertaken. For cultural studies, this is a crucial aspect. What are the domains in which identity can be forged? How does one forge a new identity? By modifying the self. Think of implants, prosthesis, cosmetic and elective surgeries, the addition of technological gadgetry to your modes of thinking and living, all of which help aid us into modifying the self. By modification of the self, I am not speaking only in terms of a change in the physical appearance of a person through cosmetic surgery. I am speaking of the identity or the self as a project where modes of thinking and modes of behavior can themselves be transformed because of technological interventions. If you can be conditioned and acculturated and interpolated into behaving like a girl or like a woman or like a mother, surely then, if we have enough resources, technological, financial and others, you should be able to modify that self into something else. What has happened with globalization and the new technologies is these provisions now exist. It's now possible for you to be not restrained and restricted to any identity. So the identity project now is more a project to do with the reinventions of the self. These of course are subject to matters of public approval, which includes social acceptance or non-acceptance, the state's intervention, and of course the corporate financial part of it. Whether identities are fluid or not, therefore, is not automatically something you can pick. You should be able to afford it, the social circle in which you move should be able to accept it, and the government should make it possible for you to live that way. Having said that, people also experience occasionally a crisis in identity. I mentioned one very early about certain identities being rendered invisible. However, it's also possible that sometimes people with a certain identity are unhappy with that identity because they do not believe the socially sanctioned identity fits them or rather they don't fit the socially given identity. And in such cases, you experience a crisis because there is a complete disconnect between what the social order thinks you should be and what you want to be yourself. This happens at national levels, social levels, and individual levels. Parents saying, I don't like you behaving like this. Oh, but this is the way I want to behave. What do we see from these two cases? In both cases, what you're saying is the social, familial norms, frames of identity, and the individual saying, I don't accept 1 and 2, 3 maybe I will, because that's not me. Think of the catchphrase which we hear all the time now, that's not me. But what exactly is me? A crisis in identity is a crisis in the representation of your identity by the social order and your unwillingness or unsuitability for that particular pre-assigned role. You might recall frequently debates in the newspaper about size 0 among girls, anorexic looking girls. The most recent example would be Anushka Sharma from last year. We have had Kareena Kapoor, 2 examples from our own recent past in popular culture. One argument made was, look, she's entitled to the way she wants to look, her appearance. That's entirely up to her. The backlash was, yeah, but she's setting up a model that we don't want our children to adopt. So there is a social idea of beauty, of health, of appearance, which these characters don't seem to fit into. So our idea of the feminine Indian woman, the ultra feminine Indian woman, or the beautiful and ultra feminine Indian woman, I'm using 3 categories, the feminine, ultra feminine, and the beautiful. Those norms exist, and suddenly you discover there are 2 people who don't fit that, and then the immediate response is, no, maybe she is entitled to do that herself, but because she is a celebrity, it's a danger to people who might want to imitate her. What you're looking at here is a crisis in identity, because if either Kareena Kapoor or Anushka Sharma chooses to be size 0, she should have the right to be size 0. But the response is, no, but you need to have a little more sense of social responsibility because you are a model, and we do not want girl children growing up saying, I want to be like that. A crisis in identity, therefore, is this misfit between the right to identity and the socially ordained role or identity bestowed upon you, and which, of course, you don't fit. Another very frequent example for this would be migrant children. Immigrants who are second generation born in the United States or in any other part of the world are told that they are at once Indian and American. Now they are brought up, acculturated into the American system. They think in many ways like Americans. They behave like Americans. Now when you say, but that is not acceptable. After all, we are Indians here. The second generation Indians would therefore be very confused because their memories and cultural acceptance of Indianness is very far back in time. In other words, they simply don't know it. A crisis in identity is perpetuated here because the senior generation, the first generation migrant, still holds certain Indian values, norms of behavior, which the second generation they hope will take, but the second generation, which is far more Americanized, simply does not connect to this identity of being Indian and American. To them, they're just American. Now, how do you expect them to respond to the pre-given identity? Please remember, you're always Indian. Please remember, these are your values. In many cases, this causes a conflict because the idea of being an Indian simply does not arise in their heads. Their identities for a very long time, since the time of their birth, has always been just American. Now, if you look at all that we have been dealing with so far, we are looking at identity not as a fixed entity. Whether it is the immigrant child, whether it is the girl who grows up becoming feminized, becoming woman, whether it is the old man who does not behave or present himself as an old man, what we are looking at is identity is a very unstable thing. For cultural studies, identity being unstable automatically means identity is subject to power relations, cultural practices, and norms. If I choose to be different from the way I am now, I cannot take that decision on my own until the social order approves of it. This automatically means I am part of a power relation where the society has a right to deny me a certain identity, even though I might choose to think of myself in a certain way. I do not know whether you are aware of the fact that you cannot change your name to God. Officially, if you file a case saying, hereafter I should be known as God, the court does not grant you the right to be called God. Why? Because supposedly you may have the right to change your name, but certain names you can't adopt. They are kept out of the purview. Now, this automatically means that the choice of my name is not strictly speaking mine alone. We are involved in a power relation because the society has a right to overrule what I have to say about myself, what I think of myself, and the way I represent myself. What cultural studies is interested in is, therefore, at several levels, to be summarized as follows. Identity is fluid, identity is unstable, identity can be altered and modified. Identity is something you fit into because these roles, these identity complexes pre-exist you. Once you fit into those roles, you perform those roles again and again. There is a possibility of resisting that kind of pre-given identity. For culture studies, this pre-given identity is very often an imposition. To go back to the point I made about femininity and the feminist response to that. In many cases, there has been resistance because there seems to be a crisis in identity based on our sense of ourselves and what the socially ordained identity is given to us. What we are looking at here for cultural studies, therefore, is identity as a field of conflict and of tension, as unstable but not always fixed. Power relations are something we do not quite recognize. They come to us in cultural forms. For cultural studies, when advertisements highlight fairness, a certain kind of mathematical ability, or certain disciplines like sciences, we are enmeshed in power relations because we are told this is what you ought to become, this is what you ought to get your children to become. These are power relations because norms of behavior are being established. If you don't fit, you are called a deviant, right? In cultural studies, the establishment of norms is a power relations. So to quickly summarize what I have said so far, identity being unstable, identity being the effect of performance, identity is given to us to be performed through a process of acculturation that starts with the family, goes on through education and social knowledge that is available to us. Identity is something you can play around with a little bit, but that also requires social approval. Very often, crisis in identity can occur because of the disconnect you think between what you are and what the preordained social identity given to you. For cultural studies, all of this is enmeshed in power relations because the process of establishing norms of identity are exercises in power. Thank you.